Listen. The only sound is the gentle, metronomic ticking of the mantel clock and the soft hiss of the gas lamp. The air in the nursery is still and heavy with the scents of lavender water and starched linen. In the cradle beside you, the child is sleeping, a perfect miniature being whose arrival was meant to be the crowning achievement of your existence. You are a wife. You are by every measure of your society complete. But as you stare at the intricate lace of the bassinet, you feel none of the serene, beatific joy described in sermons and conduct books. Instead, a cold, grey fog is rolling into your mind, a profound and terrifying emptiness where maternal instinct ought to be. You feel a dread so immense it seems to have a physical weight. The angel in the house is supposed to feel love, not this hollow echo. And the most terrifying thought of all is not the feeling itself, but the question, what if someone finds out? To comprehend the diagnosis of puerperal insanity, one must first understand the suffocating ideological framework in which the Victorian woman lived. The 19th century, particularly in Britain and America, was governed by the doctrine of separate spheres. This social theory posited that men and women were fundamentally different, destined to occupy distinct realms of existence. The man's place was the public sphere, the world of commerce, politics, industry, and intellectual life was the private sphere, the home. This ideal was most famously codified in Coventry Patmore's 1854 narrative poem, The Angel in the House. The title itself became shorthand for the perfect Victorian wife and mother. She was expected to be the moral compass of the family, a creature of sublime purity, piety, and devotion. Her purpose was not to act, but to influence, not to create, but to inspire. She was to be submissive to her husband, a comforting presence who could soothe the anxieties he brought her in from the brutal public world. Her domain was the domestic, and within it, she was to be an expert manager of the household, a gracious hostess, and, above all, a selfless mother. This was not merely a poetic ideal, it was a prescription for living, reinforced by religious doctrine, scientific theory, and legal precedent. Sermons praised the virtues of female domesticity. Medical texts argued that a woman's physiology and nervous system were inherently more delicate, making her unsuited for the rigors of public life and perfectly designed for nurturing. Legally, under the principle of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was subsumed into that of her husband. She had little to no independent control over her property, her earnings, or even her own children. Her entire social and economic existence was contingent upon her successful performance within the domestic sphere. At the apex of this performance was motherhood. Childbirth was considered the ultimate fulfillment of female destiny, a sacred duty to her husband, her family, and the nation. The maternal instinct was not seen as a complex psychological and hormonal process, but as a divine, innate quality that all normal women possessed. The image of the Victorian mother was one of placid serenity and infinite patience. She was depicted in art and literature as perpetually calm, her life a constant, joyful sacrifice for her children. The pressure to conform to this impossible standard was immense. It created a rigid binary: a woman was either a domestic angel or a fallen woman. There was no socially acceptable middle ground. The ideal allowed for no expression of ambivalence, frustration, anxiety, or exhaustion. A new mother who felt overwhelmed, disconnected from her baby, or who experienced profound sadness was not simply a human being struggling with a monumental life change. She was a failure. She was an anomaly. She was deviating from her God-given nature. This ideological construct created a fertile ground for pathology. When a woman who had just undergone the physically and emotionally grueling ordeal of childbirth, her society lacked the conceptual tools to understand it as a natural response. The problem could not be the social pressure, the isolation, or the physical trauma. The problem, therefore, had to reside within the woman herself. A moral failing, or, in the most severe cases, a complete unraveling of the mind. It was this conceptual failure that allowed the medical establishment to step in, armed with a new and terrifying diagnosis for the angel who had inexplicably, monstrously faltered. The failure of the individual woman to embody the domestic ideal was thus not merely a personal or moral lapse. It was a malfunction. And in the 19th century, an age of burgeoning science and fervent classification. A malfunction demanded a medical explanation. To understand how the anguish of a new mother was codified into a specific form of madness, we must examine the intellectual landscape of Victorian psychiatry, emerging from the shadows of superstition but not yet illuminated by the insights of modern psychology. It was a world governed by the alienist, the precursor to the modern psychiatrist, a physician who specialized in the study and management of alienation of the mind. The foundational principle of 19th century psychiatry, or mental science, was a relentless drive to classify. This was the era of the great nosologists, who sought to create a definitive taxonomy of mental disorders, much as a botanist would classify plants. Influenced by pioneers like Philippe Pinel in France, who had famously unchained the inmates of the Salpêtrière asylum of demonic possession or divine punishment, they viewed it as a disease of the brain and nervous system. This somatic, or body-based, approach was a critical step toward medicalizing mental illness, but it was a step taken with profoundly limited tools. Without the ability to scan the living brain or analyze neurochemistry, diagnosis was based entirely on the observation of external behavior, which was then fitted into a rigid and often simplistic set of categories. For much of the Victorian era, insanity was broadly divided into a few key types. The first was mania, characterized by agitation, delusions often of grandeur, and violent or unpredictable behavior. Its opposite was melancholia, a state of profound depression, lethargy, and suicidal ideation, which was often believed to have a physical cause, such as an imbalance in the bodily humors or a weakness in the nervous system, which in the 19th century sense referred to a general and often irreversible decline in cognitive and intellectual function. Finally, there was the popular diagnosis of monomania, a fixation on a single, irrational idea or delusion while the rest of the mind appeared to function normally. The underlying assumption behind all these diagnoses was that a physical lesion or pathological process was at work. Aliens diligently performed autopsies on deceased asylum patients, searching for abnormalities in the brain, thickened membranes, excess fluid, or discolored tissue that could be definitively linked to their behavior in life. This revealed that psychological and social factors were almost entirely discounted. Trauma, grief, stress, and social pressure were not seen as primary causes of mental illness, but at best as triggers that might activate a pre-existing physical predisposition. Crucially, this entire medical framework was viewed through a profoundly gendered lens. The female mind and body were considered inherently more fragile and unstable than the male's. The central organizing principle of female health, in the view of the Victorian medical establishment, was the reproductive system. The uterus, in particular, was seen as a tyrannical organ, capable of exerting a powerful and often disruptive influence over the entire female system, from the nerves to the brain itself. The ancient concept of hysteria, derived from the Greek word for womb, hystere, was a cornerstone of this thinking. It was a vague, catch-all diagnosis applied to women exhibiting a wide range of symptoms, including anxiety, fainting, irritability, and emotional outbursts, all of which were presumed to originate from a wandering or disordered womb. Therefore, every stage of a woman's reproductive life, from puberty and menstruation to pregnancy, childbirth, and menopause, was seen as a period of heightened vulnerability to mental collapse. It was considered a medical fact that these biological events could directly provoke an episode of insanity. A young woman's first menses might be blamed for a sudden bout of menopause could be cited as the cause of delusional mania. It was not only possible but entirely logical to assume that the most physically and emotionally intense event in a woman's life, the act of giving birth, could be the direct physical cause of a unique and terrifying form of madness. The clinical gaze was primed and ready to interpret the distress of new mothers, not as a psychological reaction, but as a physiological disease, rooted in the violent, messy, and perilous reality of the lying-in chamber itself. Before a diagnosis could be rendered, a medical event had to occur, and the central event of puerperal insanity was childbirth itself, an experience that Victorian sentimentality cloaked in a veil of sacred, gentle mystery, but which was, in reality, a perilous and often brutal ordeal. To grasp the origins of the condition, we must first enter the lying-in chamber, the darkened, sealed room where, for weeks, a woman was confined before, during, and after delivery. It was a private, insulated space, often thick with a sense of foreboding, where the boundaries between life and death were perilously thin. The process of birth was, for most women, an agonizing and protracted affair, unaided by effective pain relief. While the use of chloroform was famously popularized by Queen Victoria in 1853 for the birth of Prince Leopold, its adoption was slow and met with significant resistance. Many medical professionals and religious authorities argued that the pain of childbirth was a divine biblical injunction, "In sorrow, thou shalt bring forth children," and that to alleviate it was to interfere with God's will. For the vast majority of women, labor was a marathon of intense, unmitigated pain that could last for days, leaving them in a state of profound physical and nervous exhaustion. When complications arose, medical intervention was often as traumatic as the problem it sought to solve. The 19th century saw the increasing professionalization of medicine, with male physicians and their instruments often supplanting the traditional role of the female midwife. These physicians brought tools like the obstetrical forceps, which, while life-saving in cases of obstructed labor, were fearsome iron instruments, could cause severe internal lacerations to the mother and physical trauma to the infant. Other invasive procedures, such as symphysiotomy, the surgical division of the pubic cartilage to widen the birth canal, or embryotomy in the case of a deceased fetus, were violent, bloody, and carried an enormous risk of subsequent complications. Yet, the single greatest danger lurking in the lying-in chamber was an invisible one: infection. The great scourge of 19th century maternity was puerperal fever, or childbed fever. This was a virulent form of septicemia, a bacterial infection of the genital tract after childbirth. The principles of germ theory were not widely accepted until the latter part of the century. The pioneering work of figures like Ignaz Semmelweis in Vienna, who demonstrated in the 1840s that hand-washing with a chlorine solution could drastically reduce mortality, was largely ignored or ridiculed by the medical establishment for decades. Doctors and medical students would routinely move from conducting autopsies on infected corpses directly to the lying-in chamber to assist in a delivery, carrying lethal bacteria on their unwashed hands. The results were catastrophic. In the great lying-in hospitals of Europe, mortality rates from puerperal fever could be staggering, sometimes reaching 20 or 30% in certain wards. An outbreak could sweep through a hospital, turning a place of birth into a charnel house. Even in the context of a home birth, the risk of infection from an attending physician or midwife, or from unhygienic conditions, was ever present. The onset of the fever was swift and terrifying: chills, a soaring temperature, abdominal pain, and a rapid decline into delirium and, frequently, death within days. Every new mother and her family lived under the shadow of this threat. For the woman who survived the birth itself, the physical aftermath could be severe. Significant blood loss was common, leading to postpartum hemorrhage and chronic anemia, resulting in persistent weakness, dizziness, and pallor. The physical injuries from a difficult birth could lead to chronic pain, incontinence, and uterine prolapse. She was often physically depleted, nutritionally deprived after weeks of a restricted lying-in diet, and sleep-deprived from the demands of a newborn. This was the physiological state from which she was expected to emerge radiant and serene, into the idealized role of the Victorian mother. She had just endured a major medical trauma, survived a statistically significant risk of death, and was now physically and hormonally in a state of profound flux. It was upon this foundation of pain, fear, exhaustion, and depletion that the first signs of what the aliens' tests would call madness began to appear. It was in this crucible of physical depletion and psychological stress that the first signs of the disorder would manifest. For the family, and soon for the family physician, the change in the new mother was oft terrifyingly abrupt. The serene, if exhausted, woman who had survived the lying-in chamber was suddenly replaced by a stranger. This transformation was not understood as a psychological response to trauma or overwhelming change. It was seen as the eruption of a distinct and virulent disease of the mind, a malady with a specific name, Puerperal Insanity. The term itself was precise in its scope. It was a madness born of motherhood, specifically linked to the puerperium, the period of roughly 6 weeks following childbirth when the mother's body was thought to be returning to its non-pregnant state. Physicians of the era considered this a uniquely vulnerable time, and any mental disturbance within this window was given this specific diagnostic label. It was formally entered into medical textbooks and asylum records, a recognized and feared complication of maternity. The symptomatology, as documented in countless 19th century medical journals and case notes, was typically divided into two primary forms, mirroring the broader classifications of insanity, mania, and melancholia. The manic presentation was often the most dramatic and alarming. It was characterized by a state of high excitement, incessant and often incoherent speech, and a complete refusal to sleep. The woman might sing, shout, or tear her clothing for days on end. She would often reject all food and drink, leading to rapid physical deterioration. Her behavior could be violent and unpredictable, requiring several people to restrain her. Delusions were common, often of a paranoid nature, believing her husband or nurse was trying to poison her. But the most alarming feature of puerperal mania, the one that struck terror into the hearts of families and physicians alike, was the potential for violence directed towards her own infant. Reports of mothers attempting to harm their newborns, driven by what was seen as a complete and horrifying inversion of the maternal instinct, solidified the diagnosis as one of particular danger. The melancholic form was the dark mirror of the manic state. Here, the woman would sink into a profound and stuporous depression. She might exhibit an utter apathy, lying motionless for hours or days, staring at the ceiling. She might refuse to speak, a condition known as mutism, or communicate only in whispers. Often, this state was accompanied by powerful delusions of guilt and sinfulness. She might believe she was damned for some imagined transgression, that she had committed an unforgivable sin, or that she was morally unfit to be a mother. In this state, she would display a complete and terrifying aversion to the newborn, refusing to hold, feed, or even look at the child. Suicidal ideation was a constant risk, with many case notes detailing the need for constant surveillance to prevent the patient from taking her own life. The patient's delusional ideation was rarely abstract. It was intimately, unfrighteningly tied to her new reality as a mother. A woman might become convinced that her child was not her own, that it had been switched at birth with another. Others developed belief that the infant was a demon, or conversely, a divine savior whose presence she was unworthy of. Religious themes were pervasive. A patient might believe she was the Virgin Mary, or that she was being punished by God for her perceived impurity. These were not seen as metaphors for psychological distress, but as literal, factual evidence of a diseased brain. To the attending physician, these signs constituted a clear clinical picture. The stark contrast with the woman's previous character and the unnatural rejection of her maternal duties all pointed to a specific pathological process. This was not the hysteria they were accustomed to seeing, which was often considered a more manageable and chronic condition. This was a full-blown, acute insanity, an explosion of madness that had seemingly been detonated by the act of childbirth, having named and described the condition. The urgent task for the Victorian medical mind was to uncover its physical cause, to find the flaw in the female machine that allowed the sacred act of creation to so catastrophically malfunction. With the symptoms categorized and the diagnosis applied, the Victorian medical mind turned to the most pressing question: what was the underlying cause? The conviction that insanity was a disease of the physical body demanded a physical explanation. The alienist, functioning as a medical detective, began to assemble a list of potential culprits, weaving together anatomical speculation, physiological theory, and deeply ingrained social biases. The resulting theories of causation for puerperal insanity reveal a profession grappling with a complex phenomenon using a limited and often flawed set of tools. These theories were not necessarily mutually exclusive. A physician might cite several in a single case, creating a comprehensive, if ultimately incorrect, picture of pathology. The most dominant and widely accepted class of theories was somatic, locating the origin of the madness directly within the traumatized postpartum body. At the forefront was the concept of sympathetic irritation. It was posited that the uterus and its surrounding organs, having undergone the immense strain of labor and delivery, were in a state of extreme distress. Lacerations, inflammation of the uterine lining, meteorites, or even the retention of small fragments of the placenta could create a focal point of morbid irritation. This irritation, it was believed, did not remain localized. Instead, it was thought to transmit pathological signals up through the sympathetic nervous system directly to the brain. In this model, the brain was not the primary site of the disease but the ultimate victim of a crisis originating in the pelvis. The mind was, in effect, being poisoned by a disordered reproductive system, a direct and dramatic extension of the long-held theories of hysteria. Closely related were theories centered on the state of the blood. One school of thought pointed to anemia. A difficult childbirth was often accompanied by significant hemorrhage. This loss of blood, physicians argued, could starve the brain of the vital nourishment it needed to function correctly. A brain in an anemic state was considered weak, unstable, and prone to malfunction, leading to the delusions of melancholia or the uncontrolled energy of mania. The opposite theory was one of toxicity. It was believed that the natural postpartum discharge, the loci A, was a vehicle for expelling morbid humors from the body. If this process was suppressed or incomplete, these toxic elements would be reabsorbed into the bloodstream. This condition, sometimes called lociometra, would result in a state of sepsis or blood poisoning, which would then manifest as insanity when the tainted blood reached the brain. This theory gained particular traction because it seemed to align with the delirium often observed in fatal cases of puerperal fever. A second category of causation focused less on a specific physical event and more on the patient's inherent constitution. This was the theory of hereditary taint or neuropathic predisposition. Aliens were firm believers a tendency towards insanity ran in families. They would meticulously investigate a patient's lineage, searching for any relatives, parents, aunts, cousins, who had ever been committed to an asylum or were known to be eccentric or nervous. It was seen as powerful evidence. In this framework, childbirth was not the root cause of the insanity, but merely the exciting cause, the trigger that activated a pre-existing, latent weakness in the woman's nervous system. This explanation was convenient, as it helped to account for why the majority of women did not succumb to the condition after giving birth. The fault lay not in the universal experience of childbirth, but in the flawed bloodline of the individual. Finally, physicians did acknowledge the role of moral or psychological factors, though they were almost always viewed as secondary to a physical cause. A sudden emotional shock during the vulnerable puerperal period could be the final push into madness. The moral causes listed in casebooks are a litany of 19th-century domestic tragedies discovering a husband's infidelity, the profound grief of a stillbirth or the death of the infant shortly after birth, the acute social shame of an illegitimate child, or even extreme fright, such as a fire in the home. These events were thought to deliver a shock to the already weakened nervous system, disrupting its delicate equilibrium and precipitating a mental collapse. But again, this was only considered possible in a woman already rendered vulnerable by the physical trauma of birth or a tainted heredity. The mind, on its own, was rarely seen as powerful enough to generate such a profound disorder. It was the physical body that failed first, dragging the mind down with it. Immerse was not a mere armchair speculator. He was a meticulous clinician, a product of the rigorous French school of psychiatric observation. His treatise was not built on abstract theory but on the direct, systematic analysis of cases he had personally observed at the great Parisian asylums of Bicêtre and Salpêtrière. This empirical foundation gave his work an immediate and powerful air of scientific authority that set it apart from previous writing. He approached the subject with the dispassionate rigor of a naturalist, seeking not just to describe, but to classify and quantify. One of Immerse's most significant contributions was his detailed taxonomy of the disorder. He was among the first to clearly differentiate between three distinct periods of vulnerability. He described insanity of pregnancy, noting its relative rarity and often melancholic character. He then detailed the acute and more common puerperal insanity, the madness of the new mother, which erupted in the days and weeks immediately following delivery. Finally, he identified insanity of lactation, a more gradual decline in mental health that could occur during the months of breastfeeding, which he often attributed to physical exhaustion and nutritional depletion. This subdivision provided physicians with a much more nuanced diagnostic toolkit. Furthermore, Mars brought statistical analysis to the forefront. He diligently compiled data to estimate the incidence of the condition, concluding it occurred in roughly 1 out of every 400 to 500 births. He tracked outcomes, noting that puerperal insanity, while terrifying in its onset, was not necessarily a life sentence. He calculated recovery rates, suggesting that a significant majority of women, perhaps as high as 70% in his estimation, could eventually recover their sanity, though he warned that the risk of relapse in subsequent pregnancies was high. He also noted a mortality rate, linking it primarily to the patient's refusal of food or to underlying physical diseases like tuberculosis, which could flourish in a debilitated state. This use of numbers transformed the understanding of puerperal insanity from a collection of frightening anecdotes into a predictable, measurable clinical phenomenon. In his analysis of causation, Mars was an effective synthesizer. He gave significant weight to the role of hereditary predisposition, echoing the consensus of his peers. He believed that an inherited neurotic constitution was the single most important factor predisposing a woman to mental collapse under the strain of childbirth. However, he also meticulously documented the physical exciting causes, from the shock of a difficult labor to the debilitating effects of hemorrhage and the potential toxicity of postpartum infections. He acknowledged the role of moral causes like grief or fright, but, like his contemporaries, saw them primarily as triggers for an underlying physical or hereditary vulnerability. The impact of Mars's treatise was profound and far-reaching. It was quickly translated and became the standard reference work for aliens deaths in Britain, Germany, and the United States. For the first time, a local family doctor, faced with a distraught and delusional new mother, could consult an authoritative text that confirmed his observations, offered a precise diagnosis, provided a statistical prognosis, and suggested a course of action. And while Mars advocated for therapies like rest, hydrotherapies like rest, and proper nutrition, he also strongly endorsed the prevailing view that the best and safest place for treatment was a purpose-built institution. He argued that removal from the chaotic and emotionally charged home environment was essential for recovery. By codifying the disorder with such scientific precision, Mars's work inadvertently solidified the rationale for institutionalization. It provided the medical justification that, when combined with the legal structures of the time, created a clear and terrifyingly efficient pathway from the nursery to the asylum. The husband, now armed with a definitive medical diagnosis from his doctor, was empowered to take the next decisive step. The scientific authority of Mars's treatise provided the diagnosis, but a diagnosis alone could not deprive a woman of her liberty. For that, a legal mechanism was required. In the 19th century, this mechanism was not a complex, adversarial court proceeding, but a simple, administrative process, and the prime mover in this process was almost invariably the husband. The decision to commit a wife to an asylum was rooted in a legal and social structure that granted the male head of the household an almost absolute power, a terrible prerogative over the lives of his family members, and especially over his wife. The foundation of this power was the legal doctrine of coverture. Derived from English common law and transplanted to the United States, coverture held that upon marriage, a woman's legal rights and obligations were subsumed by those of her husband. She became a femi covert, a covered woman. In the eyes of the law, husband and wife were a single entity, and that entity was the husband. This had profound consequences. A married woman could not own property in her own name, enter into contracts, or sue or be sued without her husband's permission. She had no independent legal existence. This principle extended directly into the domestic sphere, making the husband not just the primary breadwinner but the undisputed governor of the household. His home was his castle, and he was its king. When his wife, the angel in the house, transformed into a manic, delusional, or profoundly melancholic figure, it was seen as a catastrophic failure of domestic order. It was the husband's responsibility to manage this crisis. He was the one who lived with the sleepless nights, the incoherent shouting, or the terrifying silence. He was the one who feared for the safety of his newborn child. He was the one who faced the social embarrassment and the whispered gossip of neighbors and servants, and he was the one who summoned the family doctor. The consultation between the husband and the doctor was the pivotal moment. The doctor, armed with the latest medical science, would examine the wife, listen to the husband's account of her behavior, and, in many cases, confirm the diagnosis of puerperal insanity. Crucially, the doctor would then offer a course of treatment. The unanimous medical consensus of the era was that a purpose-built asylum was the ideal therapeutic environment. The doctor would explain that the asylum offered safety, preventing the patient from harming herself or her child. It provided a structured routine, free from the emotional triggers of home life. It had a specialized staff trained to manage such cases. The recommendation for institutionalization was therefore presented not as a punishment, but as the most responsible and compassionate medical decision. Faced with this expert opinion, a husband, even one who was loving and well-intentioned, was placed in an almost impossible position. To keep his wife at home would be to go against medical advice, to risk the safety of his family, and to endure a situation that was often practically unmanageable. The decision to commit was thus framed as a sad necessity, a painful but proper step taken for the good of all involved. Once this decision was made, the husband's legal power came into full force. He was the petitioner, the individual who initiated the legal process of committal. His testimony about his wife's behavior was the primary piece of evidence. He was the one who formally requested that the state intervene and remove her from the home. The wife herself had virtually no voice in this process. Her protests of sanity, her pleas to remain with her child, were easily dismissed. Her arguments might be incoherent. In a state of melancholia, she might be too withdrawn to speak at all. But even if she were lucid, her words were often interpreted through the lens of her diagnosis. A common belief among aliens' tests was that a lack of insight into one's own illness, a condition known as anosognosia, was a classic symptom of insanity. Her very denial of the charge was twisted into proof of its validity. This concentration of power in a single individual, shielded by medical authority and legal doctrine, created a system ripe for potential abuse. While many husbands undoubtedly acted out of desperation and a genuine desire to see their wives recover, the law made little distinction between a concerned spouse and a malicious one. A husband who wished to be rid of an inconvenient wife, one who was argumentative, who had her own opinions, or who held a significant inheritance he wished to control, could exploit the system. By exaggerating her nervous symptoms to a compliant doctor, he could initiate a process that was exceptionally difficult to reverse. The vague and subjective nature of the symptoms for insanity, combined with the immense legal power vested in the husband, meant that the line between medical necessity and personal convenience could become terrifyingly blurred. The husband's signature on the petition was the first, and most important, of the seals on his wife's fate. The husband's decision, however potent, was not in itself a legal instrument. For the asylum doors to open, his personal crisis had to be transmuted into an official, state-sanctioned action. This transformation was accomplished through a cold, bureaucratic ritual, the collection of signatures on a set of prescribed legal documents. The statutory framework for this process, particularly in Britain, was laid out in a series of legislative measures, most notably the Lunacy Act of 1845 and its subsequent amendments. These laws, while intended to regulate the trade in lunacy and prevent wrongful confinement, in practice created a remarkably efficient administrative pathway for it, one that required the formal participation of both the medical and legal professions. The first and most critical signature after the husband's petition was that of the medical practitioner. The family doctor, having rendered his diagnosis, was now required to formalize it on a legally binding document known as the Medical Certificate of Lunacy. This was not a lengthy narrative report but a standardized form, its very structure designed for speed and simplicity. The physician had to attest, under his own name and qualifications, that he had personally examined the individual in question. This personal examination was a key legal requirement, though its thoroughness was left entirely to the doctor's discretion. The certificate demanded two distinct categories of evidence. First, the doctor had to list the facts indicating insanity observed by myself. This section is a window into the subjective nature of 19th century psychiatric diagnosis. The facts recorded were often behaviors and appearances interpreted through a lens of presumed madness, a vacant and confused expression, restlessness of the hands, a wild and suspicious look in the eyes, refusal to answer questions rationally, or incoherent muttering on religious subjects. These were not objective clinical signs but subjective impressions, yet on the certificate they were presented as empirical data. The second category of evidence was facts indicating insanity committed by others. This is where the husband's testimony was formally laundered into the official record. The doctor would transcribe the husband's or a nurse's account of the patient's behavior. Her husband states that she has not slept for 4 nights. The nurse reports that she has a delusion that her child is dead and has been replaced by an imposter, or according to her family, she has attempted to strike her attendants. The certificate thus became a powerful synthesis of professional observation and second-hand reportage, with no mechanism for challenging the veracity of the latter. Once completed, this medical certificate was a formidable document. In many private cases, a single doctor's signature was sufficient to set the process in motion. Later reforms would require the attestation of 2 independent medical practitioners, but for much of the era, the family doctor's word carried immense weight. The medical certificate, however, only provided the justification for confinement. It did not authorize it. For that, a second signature was required, one that carried the authority of the state. The husband would take his petition and the doctor's certificate to a local magistrate, typically a justice of the peace. The JP's role was not to conduct a medical evaluation. He was a layman, not an alien. His function was purely administrative, to ensure the paperwork was correctly filled out and that the procedural requirements of the Lunacy Act had been met. The magistrate would review the documents. He might, at his discretion, conduct a private interview with the alleged lunatic. However, this was often a perfunctory and intimidating affair. A woman already terrified and disoriented, perhaps physically restrained, and brought before a figure of male authority, was unlikely to present a calm, rational defense. Her agitation, her weeping, or her defiant silence could all be interpreted as further confirmation of the doctor's diagnosis. Satisfied that the forms were in order and the medical opinion was clear, the justice of the peace would affix his signature to the final document, the order of reception. This order was a direct command. It was addressed to the superintendent of a specific asylum, instructing him to receive and detain the named individual as a person of unsound mind. With that final stroke of the pen, the process was complete. A woman's legal identity was suspended. Her status as a wife and mother was superseded by a new, official designation, certified lunatic. The entire procedure, from the husband's initial decision to the magistrate's final order, could be accomplished in as little as 24 hours. There was no public hearing, no legal counsel for the accused, no jury of her peers. There was only a sequence of forms, a chain of signatures, a quiet and terrifyingly swift administrative process that sealed a woman's fate long before the carriage arrived to take her away. With the signatures collected and the order of reception officially stamped, the abstract legal process materialized into a concrete and irreversible physical event. The asylum, having been notified, would dispatch its agents. This was the moment of removal, a traumatic dislocation that permanently severed a woman's connection to her home, her family, and, most crucially, her newborn child. The procedure was designed for efficiency, not compassion, and it represented the final, terrifying transition from person to patient. The arrival was often deliberately unceremonious and discreet. It was not a medical ambulance that appeared, but typically an anonymous private carriage, often referred to as a lunacy carriage or fly. Its windows might be blacked out or fitted with internal shutters. The purpose was to avoid drawing the attention of neighbors and to minimize public spectacle, preserving what remained of the family's reputation. This discretion, however, only amplified the sense of a clandestine, almost shameful, operation. The men who accompanied the carriage were not usually physicians. They were asylum attendants, often large, physically imposing individuals whose primary qualification was their ability to handle difficult or resistant patients. They were practiced in the art of swift, non-negotiable removal. They would present the order of reception to the husband, who would then lead them to his wife's room. The confrontation was the point of no return. A woman in a manic state might resist violently, her struggles and shouts only serving as a real-time confirmation of the diagnosis written on the certificate. A woman in a melancholic state might be entirely passive, her catatonic compliance seen as proof of her detachment from reality. A woman who was lucid and protested rationally would face the most insidious trap. Her arguments would be dismissed as the cunning of the insane, her pleas interpreted as a desperate attempt to evade necessary treatment. There was no correct response that could halt the proceedings. The most brutal moment of the removal was the separation from the infant. Medical theory of the time strongly dictated this separation. The child was seen as a potential source of morbid excitement for the mother, a trigger that could worsen her condition. Furthermore, if the mother had exhibited any signs of violence or had delusions concerning the child, she was considered a direct physical threat. The separation was thus framed as a therapeutic necessity for the protection of both mother and child, but for the woman, it was a primal severance. She might be physically pulled away from the cradle, her final memory of home being the sound of her infant crying in another room as the front door closed behind her. This act, more than any other, cemented her loss of identity. She was no longer a mother in any practical sense. She was now cargo, being transported to a new location where her maternal role was officially and completely suspended. The journey to the asylum was an experience of profound disorientation and powerlessness. Locked inside the moving carriage, often with a female nurse or attendant as a chaperone, the woman was cut off from the outside world. The familiar streets of her neighborhood would give way to unknown roads. The journey could last for hours depending on the asylum's location. During this time, the reality of her situation would begin to solidify. She was a prisoner, captured not by law enforcement for a crime, but by a medical legal process she could not comprehend or contest. The destination was not a hospital in the modern sense, a place of healing from which one expected to return, but a remote and oft unfeared institution from which return was uncertain at best. Finally, the carriage would slow, and the sound of its wheels would change from the dirt road to a gravel drive. Through the window, she would get her first glimpse of her new home. Victorian asylums were rarely modest structures. They were vast, imposing edifices often built in the formidable Gothic Revival or Italianate styles. They were designed to inspire awe and a sense of order, but their sheer scale, high walls and small, barred windows communicated a different message on a permanent containment. The carriage would pass through a heavy iron gate, manned by a porter who would lock it securely behind them. This sound, the clanging of the gate, the turning of the massive lock, was the true sound of her committal. It was the closing punctuation mark on her former life. She had been successfully removed from society and delivered to the gates of an isolated, self-contained world, a world with its own rules, its own hierarchies, and its own unique architecture of control. Upon passing through the main gate, the patient entered a new domain, a carefully engineered environment where every brick and every corridor was designed to serve a dual-purpose therapy and confinement. The Victorian asylum was not merely a building, a physical manifestation of the medical and social theories that governed the treatment of the insane. Its very structure was intended to be an instrument of control, imposing order on the disordered mind through a relentless, unyielding architecture. The dominant design philosophy of the era, particularly in the United States and influential in Britain, was the Kirkbride plan. Developed by Philadelphia alien Strive, Thomas Story Kirkbride, this was a comprehensive system for asylum design rooted in the principles of moral treatment. Moral treatment was a revolutionary idea that rejected chains and dungeons in favor of a structured, humane environment that was meant to encourage the patient's return to reason. Kirkbride posited that the physical surroundings of the insane were a critical component of their cure. The asylum, therefore, should be a place of refuge, beauty, and order, situated in a peaceful, rural landscape, away from the corrupting influences of the city. The architectural expression of this philosophy was the linear plan asylum. A large central administration building, which housed offices, staff quarters, and reception areas, formed the core. From this center, two long wings extended outwards, one for male patients and one for female. These wings were staggered in an echelon or battering formation, ensuring that every patient room had access to fresh air and sunlight, key elements of the therapeutic regimen. The building itself was a hierarchy made physical. The wings were subdivided into separate wards, and patients were segregated according to the severity and prognosis of their condition. The most hopeful and manageable cases, often the private, paying patients, were housed in the wards closest to the central building. The further one moved down the long corridors, away from the administrative center, the more intractable the patients became. Culminating in the refractory wards at the far ends of the wings, where the most violent, noisy, or chronic cases were housed. A patient's location within the building was a direct reflection of her perceived place on the spectrum of madness. These institutions were designed to be almost entirely self-sufficient communities, further enhancing their isolation. The extensive grounds, often covering hundreds of acres, were not just for aesthetic appeal. They contained a working farm, which supplied the asylum with food and provided therapeutic labor for male patients. There were workshops for artisans, a large industrial laundry, a bakery, a boiler house providing heat and steam power, and often a tailor's shop, its own water supply, and its own mortuary. This self-sufficiency was both economic and ideological. It reduced the operational cost to the state or the private corporation, but it also created a closed, hermetic world. For a patient, entering the asylum meant leaving society behind in its entirety. The world outside the asylum walls ceased to have any immediate relevance. Inside the wards, the architecture of control became more intimate. The long, straight corridors were a key feature, designed for easy observation and the efficient movement of staff. The floors were often bare wood, scrubbed to a high polish, and the walls were painted in drab, utilitarian colors. Doors to the single patient rooms were heavy, thick, and fitted with locks that could only be opened from the outside. A small observation window or Judas hole was often set into the door, allowing staff to peer in without the patient's knowledge, reinforcing a constant state of surveillance. Windows weren't all to let in light but were invariably fitted with iron bars, grills, or hidden security features to prevent escape. Day rooms, where patients would spend their waking hours, were large, sparsely furnished spaces designed to accommodate groups under the watchful eye of a single attendant. Even the furniture was designed with control in mind, heavy, solid, and difficult to throw or break. Every element of the interior landscape, from the echoing corridors to the inescapable gaze of the staff, was calculated to break down individual resistance and enforce a collective, passive routine. It was an environment that was at once therapeutic in its intentions and profoundly carceral in its effect. The imposing architecture of the asylum was not an end in itself. It was the theater in which the central drama of 19th century psychiatry, the practice of moral treatment, was performed. Upon admission, the new patient was immediately subjected to this powerful, pervasive regimen. This was not a system of individual psychotherapy, but a totalizing environmental therapy, predicated on the belief that a disordered mind could be restored to reason by removing it from its chaotic home environment and immersing it in a world of absolute order, routine, and discipline. The goal was to re-educate the patient's habits, break the cycle of morbid introspection, and impose an external, rational structure that would, in theory, be internalized over time. The foundation of this regimen was the unvarying, relentless daily schedule, governed not by personal inclination but by the ringing of a bell. The day began at a fixed, early hour, often around 6 a.m. Patients were aroused from their beds, washed, and dressed under the supervision of attendants. Individuality was suppressed. Personal clothing was often taken away and replaced with institutional garb, simple, durable dresses of drab cotton or wool, designed for ease of laundering, not personal expression. This initial act of the day immediately established the patient's new identity as one member of a collective, subordinate to the rules of the institution. Breakfast was served at a precise time in a communal dining hall, a meal of porridge, bread, and weak tea. Meals were a cornerstone of the asylum's order, punctual, silent, and swiftly concluded. Following breakfast, the majority of able-bodied patients were assigned to their daily labor. This was occupational therapy, and it was a central tenet of moral treatment. The aliens test believed that idleness was a breeding ground for delusion and mania. Physical work was seen as a powerful therapeutic tool, meant to distract the mind from its obsessions and channel morbid energy into productive activity. For female patients, this work was a direct extension of the domestic sphere they had just left, but stripped of all autonomy. They were assigned to the asylum's vast laundry, a place of steam, heat, and grueling physical labor, washing the institution's endless supply of linen. They would work in the sewing rooms, mending clothes and linens for hours on end, or in the vast kitchens, peeling vegetables and scrubbing floors. The work was monotonous, repetitive, and essential to the economic self-sufficiency of the asylum. While framed as therapeutic, this work cure also provided the institution with a large, unpaid labor force. For patients who were too agitated or too melancholic for regular labor, or for those from wealthy families who paid for a higher class of care, physicians prescribed specific medical treatments. One of the most famous was the rest cure, popularized by the American physician Silas Weir Mitchell. This was particularly prescribed for women suffering from nervous exhaustion. The treatment was radical in its simplicity absolute, enforced bed rest for 6 to 8 weeks. The patient was confined to her room, forbidden to sit up, read, write, or even feed herself. She was subjected to a high-calorie, high-fat diet, consisting of immense quantities of milk and beef tea, intended to rebuild her depleted nervous energy. She would also receive daily massages and electrotherapy to prevent muscle atrophy. It was a regimen of total passivity designed to quell an overstimulated mind by completely subduing the body. Hydrotherapy was another cornerstone of asylum treatment, utilizing water in a variety of forms. For agitated or manic patients, prolonged immersion in a warm bath, sometimes for hours or even days, was believed to have a powerful sedative effect. Conversely, for melancholic or osteoporosis patients, more aggressive forms of hydrotherapy were used to shock the system back to life. This could involve being wrapped in cold, wet sheets or being subjected to the douche, a high-pressure jet of icy water directed at the patient's head and spine. The needle shower, which sprayed fine, stinging jets of water from all directions, was another common application. These were not seen as punitive, but as legitimate medical interventions designed to regulate the nervous system and restore mental equilibrium. Throughout the day, the patient might also be administered medications. The Victorian asylum pharmacy was limited but potent. The primary goal of medication was not to cure, but to manage. Bromides, particularly potassium bromide, were used extensively as sedatives to calm manic excitement. Chloral hydrate was a powerful hypnotic, used to induce sleep in the relentlessly insomniac. For profound melancholia or agitation, tinctures of opium, such as laudanum, were administered. These substances were effective in controlling the most disruptive symptoms, but they did little to address the underlying distress and often left patients in a state of chemical stupor. The entire day from the morning bell to the evening dose of chloral hydrate was a meticulously crafted system for replacing a woman's internal world with the asylum's external reality. When the structured routine of moral treatment and the chemical sedation of the asylum pharmacy failed to pacify a patient, the institution resorted to its final and most direct method of control: mechanical restraint. The use of physical restraints was a deeply contentious issue throughout the 19th century. Reformers like John Connolly at the Hanwell Asylum, England, championed the principle of no restraint, arguing that it was inhumane and counter-therapeutic. However, this remained a progressive ideal rather than a universal practice. In many asylums, particularly large, underfunded public institutions, restraints were considered an indispensable tool for managing a large and difficult patient population with a small number of staff. They were the instruments of last resort, the physical embodiment of the asylum's carceral function. The rationale for their use was always framed in terms of safety. Restraints were officially employed to prevent a patient from harming herself, other patients, or the staff. A woman in a state of puerperal mania, who might be striking out at attendants or attempting to dash her own head against a wall, would be deemed a candidate for restraint. Similarly, a patient suffering from profound melancholia who was assessed as a high suicide risk might be physically restrained to prevent self-harm, while the stated purpose was therapeutic, to protect the patient until her episode of agitation passed. The practical effect was to render her completely powerless and manageable. The tools of restraint were varied, a grim catalogue of 19th century institutional hardware. The most common was the straight waistcoat. Unlike its modern cinematic depiction, the Victorian version was often made of thick, unyielding canvas or leather, designed to bind the arms tightly across the chest and fasten securely in the back. It completely immobilized the upper body, making it impossible for the patient to use her hands to tear her clothing, strike out, or harm herself. A patient could be kept in a straitjacket for hours or even days at a time. For more extreme cases, more comprehensive forms of restraint were used. Strong dresses were one-piece canvas garments that laced up the back, sometimes with integrated mittens to cover the hands. Leather muffs, belts, and anklets could be used to strap a patient's limbs to the side of a heavy restraint chair or directly to a bester. The Utica crib, an invention of the New York State Lunatic Asylum at Utica, was a particularly notorious device. It was a bed in the form of a long wooden cage, with a hinged lid of wooden slats. A patient would be placed inside, and the lid would be locked down over her. She could not sit up or get out. It was, in effect, a human-sized coffin with air holes, designed to enforce absolute immobility and isolation. When a patient's behavior was deemed disruptive for the general ward, she would be removed to a separate space designed specifically for isolation. This was the padded cell. This was a small, bare room, often without a window, where the floors and walls were covered with thick padding of horsehair or coir, upholstered in canvas or rubber. The padding was intended to prevent the patient from injuring herself by banging against the hard surfaces. The door was heavy, with only a small observation portal, and it would be locked securely from the outside. A patient could be confined in such a room for an indefinite period, cut off from all human contact, with only a mattress on the floor and a chamber pot. This practice of seclusion was the ultimate form of control, removing the patient entirely from the asylum community until her paroxysm of madness had passed. These instruments and techniques were documented in asylum records with a chillingly objective, clinical tone. The daily log for a ward might simply note Mrs. B. highly excited this morning, placed in straight waistcoat and secluded at 10 a.m., or Mrs. S. remains melancholic and refuses food, restrained in bed to be fed with a stomach tube. The use of force was not seen as an act of cruelty but as a necessary, if regrettable, part of the therapeutic process. However, the line between therapeutic necessity and institutional convenience was exceedingly thin. In an understaffed, overcrowded ward, it was far easier to restrain a difficult patient than to engage with her distress. Restraint became a tool for managing labor shortages and maintaining order. For the woman subjected to these devices, the experience was one of utter terror and humiliation. Bound, gagged, or locked away, she was stripped of the last vestiges of her autonomy, her body itself becoming just another object to be managed within the asylum's unyielding system. This physical subjugation, however, was merely the overture to a more profound and subtle process of dismantlement. The straitjacket and the padded cell controlled the body, but the true work of the asylum was aimed at the mind, specifically at the deconstruction of the patient's sense of self. The total institution, as it would later be termed by sociologists, functions by systematically stripping away the identity an individual brings in from the outside world and replacing it with a new, simplified, and manageable identity, that of the inmate. For the woman diagnosed with puerperal insanity, this meant the erasure of her identity as a wife, a citizen, and, most fundamentally, a mother. The process began at the moment of admission. The first loss was her name. While her name remained on her official file, in the daily life of the ward she was often referred to simply as the patient in bed 7, or by her case number. She was no longer Mrs. Smith, a unique individual with a personal history, but a clinical case, an example of a specific pathology. Her personal clothing, the very fabric that expressed her taste and social standing, was taken from her and stored away. She was given the coarse uniform dress of the institution, a garment that immediately marked her as an inmate and visually assimilated her into the patient collective. Her personal belongings, photographs, letters, jewelry, any small tokens that connected her to her former life, were confiscated and catalogued. These items were deemed potential sources of agitation, or in some cases, tools for self-harm. Their removal, however, served a deeper purpose. It severed her tangible links to the outside world, leaving her adrift in the asylum's sterile present. The architecture of constant surveillance, with its long, observable corridors and peepholes, began to work on her psyche. The knowledge that she could be watched at any moment, without her awareness, induced a state of profound self-consciousness. This created a powerful incentive for self-policing. She would learn to moderate her behavior, to suppress any outward signs of distress or anger, not because she was feeling better, but because she knew she was being judged. This constant performance of acceptable patient behavior began to erode the boundary between her authentic feelings and the role she was forced to play to survive. Crucially, the diagnosis of insanity served as a categorical invalidation of her entire experience. Once she was labeled a lunatic, her credibility was annihilated. Her perception of reality was, by definition, considered flawed. If she complained about the treatment, the food, or the cruelty of an attendant, her complaints were not investigated as legitimate grievances, but recorded in her case notes as evidence of paranoia or persecution delusions. If she wrote a letter to her husband pleading for release, it was likely to be read by the asylum superintendent first. He had the authority to censor her mail or to withhold it entirely, under the justification of protecting the family from her deranged thoughts. This stripping of her voice, this inability to have her own narrative believed, was one of the most devastating aspects of the experience. She was rendered an unreliable witness to her own suffering. This created a psychological double bind from which there was no escape. If she passively accepted the asylum's routine, eating her meals, performing her assigned labor, and taking her medication without protest, she might be deemed improving. But this compliance often stemmed from a state of learned helplessness, a recognition that resistance was futile and would only lead to punishment. If, on the other hand, she rebelled, if she refused to work, shouted in protest, or wept with despair, her actions were seen as a confirmation of her madness, justifying more stringent controls, increased medication, or a transfer to a more secure ward. The system was perfectly circular. The asylum created the conditions for despair and rebellion, and then interpreted that despair and rebellion as proof of the underlying disease it was meant to treat. Over weeks, months, and sometimes years, this environment had a corrosive effect on a woman's core identity. The memory of her life outside the walls began to fade, becoming distant and unreal. Her sense of the future, once defined by her child's milestones and family life, was replaced by the endless, repeating cycle of the asylum's bell. The label insane, which she may have initially rejected, could begin to be internalized, treated by a staff who held absolute power over her, and with her own perceptions constantly invalidated, she might begin to doubt her own sanity. This acceptance was the final stage of institutionalization. The asylum, in its quest to impose order, had successfully broken down her previous self, leaving a void that was filled by the only identity left to her: the quiet, compliant, and permanent patient. While the woman was undergoing this systematic psychological dismantling within the asylum walls, the life she had been forced to leave behind was irrevocably altered. At the heart of this alteration was the silent, profound presence of the infant she had left in the nursery. The separation of mother and child, justified by the medical establishment as a therapeutic necessity, was a catastrophic event with devastating and permanent consequences for both. The empty cradle in the home was a symbol of a bond severed at its most critical and formative stage. For the child, the immediate consequence was a matter of survival. In an era before the widespread availability of safe, artificial formula, the mother's absence meant the loss of the primary source of nutrition: breast milk. This created an immediate crisis for the family. The most common solution was to hire a wet nurse, another woman who was lactating and could breastfeed the infant. However, this was an option available primarily to the wealthy. Wet nurses were expensive, and their health and character were a constant source of anxiety. For families of modest means, the options were far more perilous. They might rely on hand feeding, using cow's or goat's milk, often diluted with water and sweetened with sugar. The milk was unpasteurized and often contaminated with bacteria like tuberculosis. Bottles and feeding implements were difficult to sterilize, leading to rampant gastrointestinal infections known as summer diarrhea or cholera infantum, which were a leading cause of infant mortality. The infant, deprived of the immunological benefits of its mother's milk, was left profoundly vulnerable to disease. The committal of the mother was, for many infants, an indirect death sentence. Even if the infant survived these initial physical challenges, the psychological and developmental impact of the separation was immense. The primary attachment bond, the crucial connection between infant and caregiver that forms the foundation for future emotional security, was violently disrupted. The child would be raised by a succession of other figures: a wet nurse, a grandmother, an aunt, or servants. The absence of the biological mother created a fundamental void. The child would grow up with a fragmented understanding of its own origins. The narrative provided to the child to explain the mother's absence was a critical and often damaging element. In most cases, the truth of her confinement in an asylum was considered a profound family shame, a secret to be guarded at all costs. The child might simply be told that its mother had died. This lie, intended to protect the child and the family's reputation, created a false history, locked away in an institution miles away. In other cases, a more ambiguous story might be told: the mother was unwell, or she had gone away on a long trip to recover her health. This explanation created a climate of uncertainty and anxiety, leaving the child in a perpetual state of waiting for a mother who would never return. The long-term effects of this maternal deprivation were significant. As the child grew, the mother's absence became a defining feature of their identity. They were the child of the madwoman, even if the word was never spoken aloud. This could lead to a profound sense of insecurity, a fear of inheriting the mother's supposed taint. The social stigma attached to insanity would be transferred to the child, who might be shunned by other children or treated with a mixture of pity and suspicion by the community. For the confined mother, the separation was a source of unrelenting anguish. Her maternal instinct, far from being extinguished by her insanity, often became the focal point of her delusions and her despair. In her letters from the asylum, when they were permitted, she would plead for news of her child, for a photograph, for a lock of hair. She would be tortured by visions of her child growing up without her, learning to call another woman mother. The very condition that led to her confinement, an overwhelming and pathological response to motherhood, was exacerbated by the forced separation from her child. Her inability to perform her maternal duties was her initial crime. Her permanent punishment was the complete and total loss of the child she was accused of failing. This tragic irony was lost on the alien's death, who saw the separation not as a source of trauma, but as a necessary component of the cure. The bond was broken, and for both mother and child, the pieces could never be fully reassembled. The void left by the mother's absence was not confined to the nursery. It radiated outwards, permeating the entire household and casting a long, dark shadow over the family's social standing. The committal of a wife to a lunatic asylum was not merely a private tragedy to be endured in quiet grief. In the rigid, status-conscious world of the Victorians, it was a public catastrophe, a profound and often indelible stain upon the family name. The diagnosis of insanity was treated less like a medical condition and more like a social contagion, one that threatened to infect the reputation and prospects of everyone connected to the afflicted individual. The primary source of this intense stigma was the widespread belief in hereditary taint. As we have seen, the medical establishment considered a predisposition to insanity to be a heritable trait, a morbid poison passed down through the bloodline. This was not an obscure medical theory, it was a deeply ingrained social fear. The family of a certified lunatic was immediately viewed as constitutionally suspect. Their entire lineage was now considered flawed, their genetic stock compromised. This had devastating, practical consequences, particularly for the children left behind. A daughter of a committed mother, upon reaching marriageable age, would find her prospects severely diminished. In the calculus of the Victorian marriage market, a good family background was paramount. Her potential suitors and their families would invariably investigate her lineage. The discovery of a mad mother in the family tree was a catastrophic liability. It was feared that she carried the same latent insanity, which could erupt at any time, particularly, and this was the great fear, after she herself gave birth. She was damaged goods, the genetic risk that few respectable families were willing to take. Her future, which depended almost entirely on securing a suitable marriage, could be foreclosed by her mother's diagnosis. For the sons, the consequences were more subtle but no less damaging. As they entered the professional world, a whisper about the family madness could undermine their perceived stability and judgment, casting doubt on their fitness for positions of trust in business, law, or the clergy. The stigma also fell heavily upon the husband. The angel in the house was supposed to be a testament to a man's good judgment and his ability to govern his domestic sphere. A wife who descended into madness was a public symbol of his failure. It could be interpreted in several damaging ways. Perhaps he had chosen his wife poorly, failing to detect the signs of a tainted bloodline. Or, more insidiously, it could be seen as a reflection on his own character. His neglect or his immoral behavior had driven her to madness. His authority was undermined, his home proven to be a place not of serene order but of chaotic dysfunction. This humiliation in the private sphere could easily bleed into his public life, affecting his business relationships and his standing in the community. To manage this profound social shame, the family was forced into a life of secrecy and deception. The asylum became the unspoken place, its existence a carefully guarded secret. A complex and exhausting social performance was required to maintain the facade of normality. To inquisitive neighbors, friends, and distant relatives, a cover story was invented. The wife was not in an asylum. She was suffering from nervous exhaustion or neurasthenia, was convalescing at a sanatorium in the country, or she had gone on an extended visit to relatives in a distant part of the country, or even abroad for her health. Every letter, every social call, every chance encounter on the street became a moment of potential exposure, requiring the family to maintain their lie with absolute consistency. This conspiracy of silence inevitably led to social isolation. Fearing a slip of the tongue or the sympathetic but pitying gaze of their peers, the family would begin to withdraw from social life. They would stop hosting dinners and decline invitations. Friends and neighbors, in turn, would often collude in this isolation. Unsure of what to say and deeply uncomfortable with the subject of madness, they would simply stay away. The afflicted family was effectively quarantined, left to manage their grief. Fear and shame alone. The house, once a symbol of domestic harmony, became a silent, tense fortress, its inhabitants bound together by their shared, unspeakable secret. The stain of insanity, once applied, was almost impossible to wash away. It clung to the family for a generation or more, a constant, whispered reminder of the angel who had fallen. Beyond the profound social shame, the committal of a wife to an asylum triggered a parallel and equally devastating crisis, a financial one. An institutionalized wife was not just a social liability. She was an immense and ongoing economic burden. The diagnosis of insanity initiated a slow, relentless drain on the family's resources that could, over time, lead to complete economic ruin. This financial pressure, combined with the legal incapacitation of the patient, also created a dark opportunity for the system to be exploited for material gain, turning a personal tragedy into a mechanism for controlling property and inheritance. The Victorian asylum system was starkly divided by class. For the wealthy, there were private institutions, often called licensed houses or retreats, which operated as for-profit businesses. These asylums offered a higher standard of living, with private rooms, better food, more personal attention from staff, and a greater emphasis on therapeutic activities like reading, music, and country walks. This level of care, however, came at a steep price. The fees were comparable to those of an exclusive boarding school, charged on a weekly or quarterly basis. There were additional costs for everything from laundry and wine to the services of a private nurse or a personal carriage for outings. The financial commitment was significant and, crucially, open-ended. A stay that was initially expected to last a few months could easily stretch into years, or even a lifetime, as the patient failed to improve. For the burgeoning middle class, The cost of this private care could be crippling. A family that lived comfortably on a professional salary could find its finances completely upended by the need to pay for a wife's long-term institutionalization. Savings were quickly exhausted. Investments might have to be sold, and in the most extreme cases, the family home itself might be mortgaged or lost. The husband was often forced to make painful choices, reducing the family's standard of living, dismissing servants, and withdrawing children from private education to meet the asylum's relentless quarterly bills. The social decline precipitated by the stigma of insanity was thus accelerated by a very real and visible economic decline. If a family's resources were exhausted, or if they were of the working class to begin with, the only option was the public or pauper asylum. These were vast, state or county-funded institutions that housed thousands of patients. While the principle of moral treatment was still the official ideology, the reality in these overcrowded and perpetually underfunded facilities was far grimmer. The care was custodial, not therapeutic. The food was basic, the clothing coarse, and the staff-to-patient ratio impossibly low. A woman who began her confinement in a private retreat could find herself transferred to a pauper asylum once her family's money ran out, a descent that marked the final stage of her social and economic erasure. This economic reality was intertwined with a woman's complete legal incapacitation upon being certified insane. Under the law, a lunatic was considered an infant, incapable of managing their own affairs. This had profound implications for any property she might own. Before the passage of the Married Women's Property Acts in the latter half of the century, a husband already had significant control over his wife's assets under C. Overture. Her certification as a lunatic provided the legal mechanism for him to gain absolute control. The husband could petition the Court of Chancery or a similar legal body like the Commissioners in Lunacy to be appointed as the committee of his wife's estate. This granted him the legal authority to manage all her financial assets, her property, her investments, her income. The stated purpose of this arrangement was to ensure that her wealth was used for her maintenance and care in the asylum. However, the oversight was often minimal. An unscrupulous husband could now control his wife's entire fortune. He could place her in a moderately priced institution, pay her bills from her own funds, and then be free to use the surplus of her income for his own investments, to pay his own debts, or to fund a new lifestyle. The diagnosis of puerperal insanity, in such a case, became the key that unlocked his wife's inheritance. This financial motive, though likely not the primary driver in most cases, provided a sinister undertone to the entire process of committal. The law and its attempts to provide for the care of the mentally ill had created a system that could be weaponized. A wife with an independent fortune who became inconvenient, argumentative, or simply depressed after childbirth could be removed from the equation, her wealth legally transferred to her husband's control under the unimpeachable guise of medical necessity. The financial ruin that befell so many families was thus the tragic flip side of the financial opportunity that the system, however inadvertently, offered to a few. The terror of unjust confinement and the ambiguous figure of the madwoman were not confined to the pages of medical journals and legal statutes. They haunted the popular imagination, finding their most potent and enduring expression in the Gothic and sensation novels of the Victorian era. Literature became a dark mirror, reflecting and amplifying the societal anxieties surrounding female insanity, inheritance, and the terrifying power of patriarchal control. While rarely depicting puerperal insanity with clinical specificity, these novels explored its underlying themes, providing a powerful, albeit melodramatic, counter-narrative to the official medical discourse. The archetypal figure in this literary tradition is the madwoman in the attic, a phrase famously coined by 20th-century critics Henry Gilbert and Susan Grubar. The trope's most iconic embodiment is Bertha Mason in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, 1847. Bertha is the hidden, insane wife of the novel's hero, Mr. Rochester. She is the dark secret locked away on the third field hall, her existence a legal and social obstacle to Rochester's happiness with Jane. Rochester's description of her condition to Jane is a catalogue of Victorian fears about female derangement. He claims her madness is hereditary, a taint in her bloodline, and that it manifests in a pyromaniac rage and a complete loss of reason. Bertha is depicted not as a suffering human being, but as a subhuman, animalistic creature, a clothed hyena who growls and crawls on all fours. She is the ultimate cautionary tale, the angel of the house monstrously inverted into a demon. Her confinement is presented by Rochester as a sad but necessary act of public safety, an exact echo of the justification used for asylum committal. The sensation novels of the 1860s took these themes and brought them from the remote Gothic mansion into the seemingly placid, respectable middle-class home. Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White, 1859, is a masterclass in exploiting the fear of wrongful confinement. The central plot revolves around a conspiracy by the villainous Sir Percival Glyde and Count Fosco to steal the inheritance of the heroine, Laura Fairley. Their method is chillingly plausible. They exploit her uncanny resemblance to a mysterious, escaped lunatic named Uncuther. After orchestrating Laura's death, they have her secretly committed to a private asylum under Anne's name. The ease with which this is accomplished is the novel's central horror. The signatures of a compliant doctor and the word of a powerful man are all that is needed to erase a sane woman's identity and consign her to a living tomb. The asylum in Collins's novel is a place of absolute terror, where Laura's rational protests are systematically dismissed as delusions, a perfect illustration of the psychological trap of institutionalization. Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret, 1862, subverts the trope. Here, the beautiful and seemingly perfect Lady Audley is not the victim but the perpetrator. It is revealed that she is a bigamist who, in her previous identity, abandoned her husband and child. When her first husband reappears, she attempts to murder him and, to silence a witness, tries to have him declared insane. Later, when her own crimes are uncovered, her defenders attempt to excuse her actions by claiming she is afflicted with hereditary madness. She is ultimately confined to a luxurious private asylum in Belgium. The novel plays with the ambiguity of her diagnosis. It is unclear whether she is truly mad or simply a cunning criminal using the diagnosis as a final, desperate gambit to escape legal retribution. This ambiguity itself was a source of profound cultural anxiety, the fear that madness could be feigned, that women could manipulate the system for their own sinister ends. These novels, while fictional, were not mere fantasy. They tapped into a vein of genuine public unease about the asylum system and the laws that governed it. Newspaper articles and pamphlets circulated stories of alleged wrongful confinement, fueling a suspicion that asylums were being used as convenient private prisons. The literary portrayal of the madwoman thus served a crucial social function. It gave voice to the voiceless, articulating the fears of women who were legally and socially powerless. It questioned the infallibility of the medical profession and the absolute authority of husbands. It suggested that the line between sanity and insanity was perhaps not as clear G.C. as the aliens claimed, and that the diagnosis of madness could be a weapon, a tool of social control used to silence inconvenient women and seize their property. The Gothic attic and the asylum ward became interchangeable symbols of female entrapment. Literary spaces where the unspeakable horrors of the real world could be safely explored and to some extent condemned. While the dominant medical, legal, and literary narratives often presented asylum committal as an unfortunate but inevitable outcome, the consensus was not absolute. Within the ranks of the medical profession itself, there were dissenting voices, skeptics and reformers who questioned the prevailing orthodoxies. These physicians, though in the minority, represented a critical countercurrent of thought, advocated for more humane and less invasive treatments, and, most radically, argued that the asylum was often the wrong environment for recovery. Their work, often overlooked in its time, planted the seeds for a more modern understanding of postpartum mental health. One of the most prominent of these figures was the English physician Robert Barnes. A leading obstetrician of the mid-19th century, Barnes approached the issue from a physiological rather than a psychiatric perspective. In his lectures and writings, he argued forcefully that many cases diagnosed as puerperal insanity were, in fact, symptoms of a physical, not a mental, disease. He was a proponent of the toxic blood theory, but he refined it with a clinical precision his contemporaries often lacked. He contended that conditions like septicemia from a retained placenta or uremic poisoning from kidney failure during pregnancy, Puerperal could produce delirium and manic behavior that mimicked insanity. His crucial insight was that these were cases of delirium, not insanity. The treatment, therefore, should not be committal to an asylum but aggressive medical intervention to address the underlying physical cause. To send a woman to a lunatic asylum because she is delirious, he famously argued, is a clinical absurdity and a cruel injustice. Another critical voice belonged to Drive. Thomas Laycock, a professor of medicine at the University of Edinburgh. Laycock was a pioneer in the study of the link between the brain and the mind, and he brought a more holistic and psychological perspective to the problem. He was deeply critical of the purely somatic and hereditary explanations for puerperal insanity. While acknowledging the immense physical stress of childbirth, he placed a much greater emphasis on what he called psychical causes. He argued that the profound emotional shock of a traumatic birth, the grief of losing an infant, the anxiety of a new mother's overwhelming responsibilities, and even the starvation of the affections in an unhappy marriage could be primary causes of a mental breakdown. This was a radical departure from the mainstream view, which relegated such factors to secondary triggers. By focusing on the patient's emotional and social context, Laycock was implicitly challenging the very foundation of asylum-based treatment, which sought to sever the patient from that context. Perhaps the most practical and influential challenge to the asylum model came from Drive. Forbes Winslow, a prominent English alienist who, despite running his own private asylum, became a powerful advocate for alternatives to institutionalization. Winslow argued that for many women, particularly those suffering from the melancholic form of the disorder, the asylum was a terrifying, uncounter-therapeutic environment. He believed that the sudden, traumatic removal from home and family often plunged the patient into a deeper state of despair, a condition he termed asylum-made insanity. In place of immediate committal, Winslow championed a model of home treatment or care in a small, domestic-style nursing home. He argued that the patient should, whenever possible, remain in a familiar environment. The key was to change the conditions within that environment. He prescribed a regimen that included the removal of the patient from the nursery to a quiet part of the house, the constant presence of a skilled and compassionate nurse, a highly nutritious diet, and gentle exercise in the fresh air. He believed that regular, supervised visits from the husband and, as the patient improved, from the child, were essential to recovery, helping to re-establish the broken bonds of affection. Winslow's approach was a direct repudiation of the isolationist principles of the large asylum. He argued that recovery was best fostered not by severing a woman's domestic ties, but by patiently, unskillfully repairing them. These dissenting physicians did not succeed in overturning the asylum system in their lifetimes. The institutional model was too entrenched, both medically and economically. However, their work was critically important. They maintained a space for clinical doubt and intellectual opposition. They insisted on a more complex and compassionate understanding of the suffering new mother, viewing her not just as a collection of pathological symptoms, but as a whole person situated within a family and a society. By emphasizing treatable physical causes, psychological stress, and the therapeutic potential of the domestic environment, they laid the essential groundwork for a 20th century revolution in psychiatric care that would eventually see the decline of the great asylums and the rise of a community and home-based model for mental health treatment. The official narrative of puerperal insanity was written in the detached, clinical language of the physician and the rigid, procedural prose of the law. The counter-narratives were crafted by novelists and dissenting doctors. But there is another, far rarer and more precious, source, the voice of the patient herself. Buried in asylum case books, family archives, and the records of the commissioners in lunacy are the surviving letters of the women who were confined. These documents are fragmentary, often censored, and invariably written from a position of profound powerlessness. Yet they offer an unparalleled, first-hand account of the experience of institutionalization, a raw and desperate testimony that cuts through the layers of medical theory and social stigma. Reading these letters an exercise in historical eavesdropping, listening to whispers from a world that was designed to be silent. The content and tone of the letters vary dramatically depending on the author's mental state and her relationship with the recipient. Many letters written are filled with a bewildered and desperate plea for understanding, the woman struggles to articulate what has happened to her, to explain the sudden, terrifying dislocation from her life. She writes to her husband not with anger, but with a profound sense of confusion, asking why she has been brought to this place, assuring him that she is not mad, and begging him to come and take her home. A common refrain is, "There has been a terrible mistake." These letters are a testament to the patient's initial, desperate struggle to hold on to her own perception of reality against the overwhelming institutional consensus that she is insane. As the weeks and months of confinement wear on, the tone often shifts. The desperate pleas for release are sometimes replaced by meticulous, almost lawyerly documentation of the injustices she perceives within the asylum. She writes of the cruelty of a specific attendant, the inedible quality of the food, the humiliation of being forcibly bathed, or the terror of being locked in seclusion, to create an external record of a reality that is systematically denied by the asylum authorities. They are sent in the hope that an outside authority, a husband, a brother, the commissioners and lunacy themselves will intervene. More often than not, these letters were intercepted by the asylum superintendent, either destroyed or simply pasted into the patient's case file as further evidence of her persecutory delusions. The most heart-aching letters are those that speak of the lost child. The maternal bond, so pathologized by the diagnosis, becomes the central theme of the patient's inner life. She pleads for information, for any small detail about the child she was forced to leave behind. Does he have his father's eyes? Has she begun to smile yet? Please send me a lock of his hair. The letters are filled with a tangible, physical yearning for the infant. The woman describes the phantom sensation of the baby in her arms, the aching of her breasts still full of milk. This anguish was not seen by the alien Stess as a natural expression of maternal love, but as a morbid obsession, a symptom of her ongoing derangement. The very thing that made her human was pathologized, for those who began to lose hope of release. The letters can take on a tone of profound resignation and despair. The writer accepts her fate, her language becoming more passive, her requests more modest. She no longer asks to be brought home, but simply for a visit, for a new book, or for a small luxury like a tin of biscuits. These letters reveal the slow, corrosive process of institutionalization, the gradual extinguishing of a woman's will to resist. Referring to herself as a patient and describing her feelings in the clinical terms she has learned from the doctors. This is the sound of a self being remade in the institution's image. Finally, there are the angriest letters. These are letters of pure, undiluted rage, written by women who have not surrendered. They rail against their husbands for their betrayal, against the doctors for their arrogance, and against a system that has spurious, capitalized accusations and threats of divine or legal retribution. To the alienist, this maniacal rage was the clearest possible proof of insanity. These letters are acts of profound if futile rebellion. They are the last, defiant screams of an identity that refuses to be erased. Scarce and scattered as they are, these letters are the most authentic historical record we possess. They are the voices from within the machine, testaments to the immense human suffering that lay hidden behind the clinical diagnosis of puerperal insanity. While these desperate voices echoed from within the asylum's walls, a profound shift was occurring in the world of medicine outside. This change did not originate in the discipline of mental science, which remained largely focused on heredity and moral management, but in a new and increasingly assertive medical specialty, gynecology. The rise of gynecology, in the latter half of the 19th century, represented a fundamental challenge to the alien Stess monopoly on explaining female madness, and seemingly more scientific etiology for puerperal insanity, one rooted not in the intangible brain or a tainted bloodline, but in the observable, accessible, and most importantly, surgically correctable pathology of the female pelvic organs. The alien Stess dominant theory of sympathetic irritation from the uterus was, for all its clinical authority, a vague and speculative concept. It posited a mysterious connection but offered little in the way of concrete, verifiable evidence. The emerging field of gynecology, by contrast, was built upon a new foundation of empirical observation. The development and popularization of instruments like the vaginal speculum afforded physicians an unprecedented degree of diagnostic visibility. For the first time, they could move beyond external palpation and patient reportage to directly inspect the cervix and vaginal walls. This technological advance transformed the female pelvis from a black box of mysterious sympathies into a tangible anatomical landscape that could be mapped, diagnosed, and, increasingly, treated. Armed with this new perspective, gynecologists began to identify a host of specific physical ailments in their female patients, many of whom also suffered from nervous symptoms. They discovered uterine displacements, such as prolapse or retroversion, where the uterus was improperly aligned. They identified and catalogued birth trauma, such as deep, unhealed lacerations of the cervix. They diagnosed chronic inflammation, ovarian cysts, and uterine fibroids. These were not incidental findings. They were the clear, physical source of the patient's suffering, both physical and mental. From these clinical observations, a powerful new theory emerged: the doctrine of reflex neurosis. This was a more sophisticated and medically detailed version of the old sympathetic irritation theory. It posited that a specific, identifiable physical lesion, a torn cervix, a displaced uterus, an inflamed ovary, could act as a constant source of peripheral nerve irritation. This irritation would then generate pathological signals that traveled up the spinal cord to the brain, producing a wide array of distant symptoms. These could include back pain, indigestion, headaches, and in the most extreme cases, hysteria, melancholia, and full-blown mania. In this model, a woman's insanity was not a disease of the brain itself, but a referred symptom of a diseased pelvis. This theory had immense appeal. It was mechanistic, materialist, and sounded rigorously scientific. It offered a clear, singular cause for a complex set of symptoms. And, most seductively, it suggested an equally clear, singular solution: surgery. If a torn cervix was the source of the reflex irritation that was causing a new mother's mania, the logical course of action was to surgically repair the tear. This procedure, known as T-Rachel or rough eye, was pioneered and heavily promoters like J. Marion Sims. In more radical cases where the ovaries themselves were deemed to be the source of the pathological irritation, or pharmectomy, the surgical removal of the ovaries was proposed as a definitive cure for a host of nervous and mental disorders. This created an immediate and often bitter professional turf war between the alienists and the gynecologists. The gynecologists began to argue that the asylums were filled with women who were not truly insane, but were merely suffering from undiagnosed and untreated pelvic diseases. They presented case studies in medical journals, claiming to have cured insane women through gynecological surgery, allowing them to be discharged from the asylum. This was a direct assault on the diagnostic authority of the alienists. The alienists, in turn, pushed back, accusing the gynecologists of being overly simplistic and dangerously interventionist, arguing that they were mistaking symptoms for causes and subjecting vulnerable women to unnecessary and mutilating surgeries. The two specialties were now in direct competition for the same patient, each offering a completely different explanation and cure for her condition. While the theory of reflex neurosis and the efficacy of the surgical cures it spawned would be largely discredited in the 20th century, the rise of gynecology had a lasting and crucial impact on the understanding of puerperal insanity. It relentlessly pushed the medical conversation toward a search for specific, physical causes. It helped to demystify the postpartum period, framing it as a time of potential physiological trauma rather than one of inherent psychological fragility. This somatic focus, though often crudely applied, was a critical step away from blaming the patient's moral character or her family's bloodline. It reinforced the idea that the mental anguish of a new mother could be a direct consequence of a treatable physical condition, a concept that would later be vindicated by the discovery of the profound hormonal shifts that govern the postpartum body. The accumulation of disquiet, the whispers from within asylum walls, the sensationalist plots of popular novels, and the increasingly vocal debates within the medical profession eventually coalesced into a force that the state could no longer ignore. Public and parliamentary consciousness had been pricked by a steady stream of scandals, often amplified by a crusading press and advocacy groups like the Alleged Lunatics Friends Society. The central anxiety was that the legal machinery of committal, designed in the 1840s to bring order to the chaos of private madhouses, had itself become a tool of potential tyranny. The ease and privacy of the process, once seen as a virtue to protect family reputation, were now viewed as its most dangerous flaws. The growing sentiment was that a medical diagnosis, no matter how authoritative, should not be sufficient grounds to indefinitely suspend a citizen's liberty without more robust legal oversight. This pressure culminated in the establishment of parliamentary select committees to investigate the operation of the lunacy laws. These committees, convened in the late 1872 and 1882, became a formal stage for the anxieties that had been simmering for decades. They gathered testimony from a wide range of stakeholders. Asylum superintendents defended their practices, concerned physicians argued for reform, and most powerfully, former patients gave harrowing accounts of their confinement. The evidence presented a troubling picture of a system that, or perhaps well-intentioned, was dangerously susceptible to error and abuse. The process of committal, based on the signatures of two doctors under single magistrate who often never even saw the patient, was condemned as a scandalously easy method of depriving individuals of their rights. The result of these years of agitation and investigation was a landmark piece of legislation, the Lunacy Act of 1890. This comprehensive act did not abolish the asylum system, but it fundamentally regenerated its gateway. It was a deliberate attempt to inject due process into what had previously been a purely administrative and medical procedure. The law was a complex document, but its central and most revolutionary change was the transfer of the ultimate authority for committal from the medical profession to the judiciary. Under the new law, the old informal order of reception signed by a justice of the peace was abolished. It was replaced by a formal reception order that could only be issued by a specially appointed judicial authority, a county court judge, a stipendiary magistrate, or a justice of the peace specifically designated for lunacy work. This was not merely a change of title. It was a change of title. It was a change of title. It was a change of function. The judicial authority was now required to personally consider the petition for confinement, which had to be presented by a relative of the alleged lunatic. The petition had to be accompanied by two separate medical certificates, as before, but the judge was now empowered to scrutinize them. Crucially, the law stipulated that the judicial authority should, whenever possible, personally see the patient. The alleged lunatic was granted the right to be informed of the proceedings and to be visited by the judge, or even to attend the private hearing, unless it was medically certified that this would be prejudicial to their health. This created, for the first time, an opportunity, however limited, for the accused to be heard by an impartial legal authority before their liberty was removed. The judge had the power to dismiss the petition if the evidence seemed insufficient, or to adjourn the hearing to gather more information. The decision was no longer a foregone conclusion based on a doctor's say-so, it was now a judicial determination. The Act had recognized that there were genuine emergencies. For these situations, it created the urgency order. This allowed for a patient to be confined for up to 7 days on the basis of one petition and one medical certificate. This was a concession to the practical reality that a violent or suicidal individual might need immediate containment. However, the urgency order had a strict time limit. For the confinement to continue beyond 7 days, a full judicial reception order had to be obtained through the proper legal channels. The impact of the 1890 Act was immediate and profound. It made the process of involuntary committal significantly more difficult, more bureaucratic, and more public. The introduction of judicial oversight acted as a powerful check on the potential for malicious or careless committal. Husbands and doctors now knew that their evidence would be subject to a degree of legal scrutiny, which likely served as a significant deterrent. The law effectively ended the era of easy, private confinement. It also had unintended consequences. Some physicians became wary of signing certificates, fearing legal liability if their diagnosis was challenged. Families, faced with a more complex and quasi-public legal process, may have delayed seeking help for a genuinely ill relative until her condition had become dangerously acute. The Lunacy Act of 1890 did not cure the problem of puerperal insanity, but it did ensure that the path from the nursery to the asylum was no longer a quiet, but a formal legal proceeding acknowledging, at last, that the loss of liberty was a matter for the law, not just for medicine. The legal reforms of the late 19th century were a reflection of a deeper, more gradual shift that was occurring in the cultural and medical understanding of mental distress. The imposing Victorian edifice of insanity, with its rigid categories of mania and melancholia, and its deep associations with heredity and degeneration, was beginning to crumble. In its place, a new and more nuanced vocabulary began to emerge, one that was less about permanent constitutional flaws and more about temporary states of functional disorder. This linguistic and diagnostic evolution would profoundly change the way the suffering of new mothers was understood, moving it away from the terrifying finality of puerperal insanity and towards a more manageable, less stigmatizing concept of disorder of the nerves. The key term in this transformation was neurasthenia, coined by the American physician George Beard in 1816. The diagnosis of neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion, became extraordinarily fashionable in the Edwardian periods. The theory behind it was that the fast pace, intellectual demands, and sensory overload of modern industrial society were particularly among the educated upper and middle classes. The symptoms of neurasthenia were famously vague and wide-ranging, encompassing fatigue, anxiety, headaches, insomnia, depression, and a general feeling of being unable to cope. This diagnosis had several crucial advantages over the older label of insanity. Firstly, it was far less stigmatizing. Insanity carried the taint of hereditary weakness and implied a complete loss of reason. Neurasthenia, by contrast, was seen as a functional disorder of the nervous system, not a disease of the mind itself. It was a sign of over-civilization and sensitivity, a condition that could afflict even the most intelligent and refined individuals. It did not intelligent and refined individuals, merely that one's system was temporarily depleted. Secondly, neurasthenia was seen as a curable condition. The prescribed treatment was not confinement in an asylum, but a period of restorative care, often involving the rest care hydrotherapy or a stay at a fashionable sanatorium or spa. It was a temporary retreat from the pressures of life, not a permanent removal from society. For women suffering after childbirth, the diagnosis of neurasthenia or postpartum nervous exhaustion offered a much more compassionate, unless terrifying framework for their experience. It acknowledged their profound physical and emotional depletion without branding them as lunatics. It provided a medical explanation for their inability to cope that did not involve invoking a monstrous inversion of the maternal instinct. The new mother was not morally failing or constitutionally flawed. Her nervous system was simply overtaxed by the immense strain of pregnancy, childbirth, and lactation. This shift was accelerated by the nascent field of psychoanalysis. The work of Sigmund Freud and his followers, which began to permeate medical thought in the early 20th century, introduced a revolutionary new way of thinking about mental distress. Freud argued that neurotic symptoms were not the result of depleted nerve force or a tainted heredity, but the product of unconscious psychological conflicts, often rooted in early life experiences and repressed desires. While Freud's theories on female psychology were controversial and often deeply misogynistic, the psychoanalytic approach had a profound effect. It legitimized the idea that a person's inner emotional world, their fears, anxieties, and traumas, could be the direct cause of their symptoms. This psychogenic model provided a powerful alternative to the purely somatic explanations of the 19th century. Within this new framework, a new mother's depression or anxiety was no longer seen as a reflex irritation from her uterus, but as a complex psychological reaction. It could be understood as a response to the trauma of a difficult birth, as ambivalence about the immense responsibilities of motherhood, or as the reactivation of earlier psychological conflicts. The treatment, therefore, was not the asylum's regimen of labor and sedation, but the talking cure of psychotherapy, an attempt to bring these unconscious conflicts into the light of day. As these new concepts of neurasthenia and psychogenic illness gained traction, the old diagnosis of puerperal insanity began to fall out of use. It started to sound archaic, a relic of a less sophisticated medical era. Physicians began to speak instead of postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, or in the most severe cases, postpartum psychosis. This was more than a simple change in terminology. It represented a fundamental paradigm shift. The problem was being relocated from the uterus to the nerves, and from the nerves to the psyche. And as the perceived location of the disorder changed, so did the perceived solution. The focus moved away from permanent, custodial care in a remote institution and toward temporary, restorative treatment, and eventually to outpatient psychotherapy. The asylum was slowly but surely becoming obsolete, not just because its laws had been reformed, but because its core intellectual justification was dissolving. The intellectual obsolescence of the Great Asylum was shadowed by its slow, inexorable physical decay. The vast self-contained institutions that had once been monuments to Victorian ambition and scientific optimism began a long, 20th century decline, becoming synonymous not with cure and refuge, but with neglect, overcrowding, and despair. The process of deinstitutionalization, which would culminate in the mass closure of asylums in the latter half of the century, was driven by a powerful confluence of medical innovation, economic pressure, and a profound shift in social philosophy. The first and most dramatic blow to the asylum's dominance was the development of effective psychotropic medications. The psychopharmaceutic revolution of the 1950s fundamentally altered the landscape of psychiatric treatment. The discovery of chlorpromazine, marketed as Thorazine, in 1952 was a watershed moment. It was the first effective antipsychotic medication, capable of controlling the most severe symptoms of psychosis, such as hallucinations and delusions, without the profound sedation of older drugs like bromides and opiates. This was soon followed by the development of the first tricyclic antidepressants and antioxidant medications, benzodiazepines. For the first time in history, physicians had a set of tools that could manage the symptoms of severe mental illness on an outpatient basis. A patient who, a generation earlier, would have been confined to a locked ward for years could now, in theory, be stabilized with medication and live in the community. These drugs were not a cure, but they made community-based care a viable possibility. They rendered the asylum's primary function, long-term custodial containment of the unmanageable, largely redundant. The very rationale for the asylum's existence was being dissolved, pill by pill. This medical revolution coincided with mounting economic and political pressure. The great Victorian asylums were enormously expensive to maintain. The sprawling, aging buildings required constant and costly repairs. Heating their vast, high-ceilinged wards was a massive financial drain. As the patient population swelled throughout the first half of the 20th century, these institutions became chronically overcrowded and underfunded, particularly the large state and county hospitals. They became human warehouses where the therapeutic ideals of moral treatment had long since been replaced by a grim, custodial reality. Post-World War II, a series of public exposes, featuring shocking photographs and first-hand accounts from journalists and conscientious objectors who had worked as attendants, revealed the appalling conditions in many of these institutions to a horrified public. Politically, a new consensus began to form, uniting official conservatives who saw the asylums as a bloated, inefficient drain on the state budget, and civil liberties advocates who viewed them as instruments of unjust confinement. The community mental health movement, galvanized by President John F. Kennedy's Community Mental Health Act of 1963 in the United States, proposed a radical new model. The future of mental health care, it argued, was not in the isolated, monolithic institution, but in a network of smaller, locally based clinics, halfway houses, and outpatient services. The goal was to treat patients in the least restrictive environment possible, integrating them into society rather than isolating them from it. The policy of deinstitutionalization began in earnest. Asylum populations, which had peaked in the mid-1950s, began a steep and rapid decline. Patients who had been institutionalized for decades were discharged, often with little more than a prescription and a bus ticket. The great asylum wings, once home to thousands, began to empty. Ward by ward, building by building, the institutions were downsized and eventually closed altogether. The closure of the asylum doors was not the utopian solution its proponents had envisioned. The promised network of community-based services was often inadequately funded or never fully materialized, leaving many former patients without support. But for the purposes of our story, the effect was definitive. The physical destination that had awaited the Victorian woman diagnosed with puerperal insanity, the imposing Gothic building at the end of a long gravel drive, was ceasing to exist. Architectural solution to her suffering was being dismantled brick by brick. The buildings themselves, too large and too stigmatized for other uses, were often simply abandoned. They were left to decay, their barred windows broken, their long corridors silent and filled with peeling paint, their once manicured grounds overgrown with weeds, vast, crumbling monuments to a superseded model of medicine and a forgotten world of suffering. The terror of being sent away was replaced by a new set of challenges, but the specific fear of the asylum, which had haunted generations, was finally being laid to rest. The crumbling of the asylum walls and the fading of the diagnostic label did not, however, mark the end of the underlying condition. The biological and psychological upheaval of childbirth remained a constant of the human experience. What changed was the framework for its interpretation. The journey from puerperal insanity to our modern understanding of postpartum mental health is a direct line, a continuous thread of inquiry that connects the observations of the 19th century aliens to the research of the 21st century neuroscientist. The names have changed, the explanations have grown more sophisticated, but the echoes of the original diagnosis can still be clearly heard. Modern medicine now recognizes a spectrum of postpartum mental health disorders. The diagnosis of puerperal insanity has been fractured and refined into several distinct, and far more precise, clinical entities. The most common of these is postpartum depression (PPD). This condition, affecting an estimated 10–15% of new mothers, corresponds closely to the melancholic form of puerperal insanity described by Victorian physicians. Its symptoms are now well-defined: persistent low mood, loss of pleasure, feelings of worthlessness and guilt, sleep disturbances, and in some cases, thoughts of self-harm or harming the infant. The key difference is in causation. Where the aliens saw a flawed heredity or a disordered womb, the modern clinician sees a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors. The most significant advance has been in the field of endocrinology. We now understand that the postpartum period is a time of extreme hormonal volatility. During pregnancy, levels of hormones like estrogen rise to extraordinary heights. Immediately after delivery, these levels plummet, a hormonal crash far more dramatic than the fluctuations of a normal menstrual cycle. This sudden withdrawal is believed to directly impact the brain's neurotransmitter systems, particularly serotonin and dopamine, which are crucial for mood regulation. This provides a concrete, physiological explanation for the emotional vulnerability of the postpartum period, a verifiable biochemical basis for the condition that Robert Barnes and his contemporaries could only guess at. The manic delusional state that the Victorians saw as the most terrifying manifestation of puerperal insanity is now classified as postpartum psychosis. This is a much rarer and more severe condition, affecting approximately 1 in 1,000 new mothers. Its onset is often rapid and dramatic, just as 19th century doctors observed with symptoms including hallucinations, bizarre delusions, paranoia, and severe mood swings. Modern psychiatry now understands this not as a unique form of madness, but most often as a presentation of another underlying severe mental illness, typically bipolar disorder or schizoaffective disorder, that has been triggered by the hormonal and physical stress of childbirth. The link to an underlying, pre-existing vulnerability is a direct echo of the Victorian concept of hereditary taint, but stripped of its moralistic and deterministic overtones. It is now understood as a matter of neurobiologic risk, not a flawed bloodline. Crucially, the modern diagnostic framework also includes conditions that the Victorians largely overlooked, such as postpartum anxiety and postpartum post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, the latter often linked to a traumatic and difficult birth experience. This acknowledges that the psychological response to childbirth is not limited to the binary of mania and melancholia, but encompasses a wide range of human emotional suffering. The treatment, of course, has been transformed. The asylum has been replaced by a combination of psychotherapy, social support, and psychopharmacology. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps new mothers challenge the negative thought patterns associated with depression and anxiety. Support groups provide a sense of community and reduce the profound isolation that was once the norm. And a new generation of antidepressant medications, particularly selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, can effectively correct the neuromechanical imbalances that contribute to the condition, often with far fewer side effects than the sedatives of the 19th century. Despite these immense advances, the echoes of the Victorian era have not been entirely silenced. The social stigma surrounding maternal mental illness, while reduced, has not been eliminated. New mothers still face immense internal and external pressure to embody an ideal of blissful natural motherhood. Many still suffer in silence, afraid to admit their struggles for fear of being judged as a bad mother. The fear that their child might be taken away from them, while no longer a function of a simple committal order, remains a powerful deterrent to seeking help. The story of Puerperal Insanity is not, therefore, simply a closed chapter of historical cruelty. It is the dark prehistory of a clinical and social challenge that we are still working to fully understand and address. It is a stark reminder of the devastating consequences when medical ignorance combines with rigid social expectations to pathologize a fundamental and fundamentally difficult human experience. We are left then with the women themselves. Thousands of them whose names exist now only as copper-paste script on the yellowing pages of asylum admission registers. They are the forgotten women, the silent casualties of a medical theory and a social ideology that saw their suffering not as a cry for help, but as a symptom of a defective nature. Their individual stories, once so full of the specific, tangible details of 19th century life, have been flattened by the passage of time into a single, collective tragedy. They have become historical abstractions, case numbers in a grim statistical record. To recover their humanity, we must try to see them not as they were catalogued, but as they were before the diagnosis descended. They were women who had navigated the complex rituals of Victorian courtship and marriage, who had managed households, and who had just passed through the terrifying ordeal of childbirth, a feat of immense physical endurance. They had held their newborns, perhaps only for a few days or hours, and had felt something, whether it was love, fear, ambivalence, or terrifying blankness. They had hopes for these children. They had a future that they believed was just beginning. They were not specimens of pathology, they were individuals at the precipice of the most profound transition of their lives, and they faltered. Their confinement in the asylum represented a kind of living death. They were removed from the narrative of their own families, their chairs at the dinner table left empty, their names spoken only in whispers, if at all. Their children grew up learning of them through a heavily edited story, a photograph of a solemn-faced stranger, or a complete and total silence. They missed the first steps, the first words, the school days, the weddings. The entire arc of the family life they had been raised to believe was their sole purpose unfolded without them, in a world from which they were permanently exiled. Within the asylum's closed ecosystem, their fates varied. The statistics compiled by men like Morse tell a part of the story. A significant number, perhaps the majority, did eventually recover. After months or even years of institutional routine, their acute symptoms subsided. They were deemed to be quiet, rational, and no longer a danger to themselves or others. For these women, the asylum doors might eventually reopen, but release was not to return to their former lives. They re-entered a world that had moved on without them. They were marked by an ineradicable stigma. They might be treated with a mixture of fear and pity by their own families, their judgment forever questioned, their every mood scrutinized for signs of a potential relapse. The relationship with the children they barely knew was often strained and awkward, an attempt to build a bond across a chasm of lost time and traumatic separation. For a substantial minority, there was no recovery. Their acute illness subsided into a chronic institutional apathy. They became the quiet, demented women who populated the back wards of the asylum for decades. They grew old within its walls, their connection to the outside world withering away as husbands remarried and children moved on. They died in the institution and were often buried in unmarked graves in the asylum cemetery, their final resting place as anonymous as their later lives had been. Their names were simply struck from the register, the final bureaucratic act in a life defined by paperwork. The tragedy of these forgotten women is not that they suffered from a condition we now call postpartum depression or psychosis. The tragedy is the response their suffering elicited. Their illness was met not with compassion, but with a fearful and rigid system of control. Their distress was interpreted through a lens of moral and biological failing that demanded their isolation. They were caught at the intersection of a primitive psychiatry, a patriarchal legal system, and an unforgiving social ideal of womanhood. The asylum was the ultimate product of this intersection, a place where a woman's complex human pain was simplified into a diagnosis, managed by a routine, and all too often silenced forever. By excavating their story, we do not just look back at a chapter of medical history, we bear witness to the profound and enduring human cost of fear and misunderstanding. And so the historical record falls silent. The great asylums stand empty, their corridors no longer echoing with the private grief of 1,000 misdiagnosed mothers. But to close the book on this chapter is not to contain its lessons. What we have witnessed is more than a story of medical ignorance. It is a profound cautionary tale about the nature of certainty itself. The Victorian alienist, armed with his classifications and his confidence, acted not out of malice, but from a conviction that he was on the side of reason, imposing scientific order upon the chaos of a disordered mind. Their certainty was their most dangerous instrument. It reminds us that the line between therapy and control, between healing and punishment, is often only as clear as the prevailing wisdom of the age allows it to be. The structures that enabled this tragedy, the absolute legal authority of the husband, the unquestioned power of the medical expert, the rigid social ideal of the perfect mother, have largely been dismantled. Yet the underlying human tendencies that built them persist. We still draw lines between the normal and the abnormal. We still feel a deep unease in the face of suffering we do not understand. And we still seek simple, definitive labels for complex, painful human experiences. The terror of puerperal insanity was not just the diagnosis, but the swift, systemic erasure of the woman's own reality. Her truth was deemed invalid, her voice silenced, her identity replaced by a case number and a set of symptoms. In the quiet of this late hour, it is worth reflecting on how fragile that sense of self can be, and how quickly it can be unmade when an individual's experience is denied by the collective. This story is over, but the weaknesses it exposed, fear of the unknown, the craving for order, the power of a label, are not historical artifacts. They are part of us. A final thought before you sleep.